The wind comes off the water before anything else. Cold, flat, insistent. It pushes against you the way it has pushed against everything here for as long as anyone can remember. You are standing at the edge of a country that should not exist. Below your feet, the ground is younger than your grandparents. The horizon is ruler straight, and the sky takes up more of the world than the land does. This is the Netherlands, and almost every square meter of it has a story that begins the same way, with water, and with the decision to fight it. For centuries, the sea was not a border here. It was an invasion that never ended. The low-lying coastline of what is now the Netherlands was one of the most dangerous stretches of populated land in northwestern Europe, a place where storms did not merely damage communities, they erased them. Villages disappeared overnight. Entire islands were swallowed. The North Sea and the Zuderzee, which was a large, shallow inland bay connected to the North Sea, treated the Dutch coastline less like a boundary and more like a suggestion. And yet, people stayed and built and lost everything and built again. The stubborn attachment to this waterlogged ground is not recklessness. It is something older and more complicated than that. The Zuderzee itself was not always an open bay. Centuries of storms and erosion had gradually widened and deepened what had once been a smaller lake, the Flevo Lake of Roman times, into an inland sea covering roughly 3,500 square kilometers. By the late medieval period, it was large enough to host major fishing fleets and trading routes, its shallow, brackish waters teeming with herring and other fish that fed entire coastal economies. Towns like Hoorn, Enkhuizen, and Volendam grew prosperous along its shores. But the same sea that fed people also threatened them. Storm surges funneled through the bay amplified the damage done to the low-lying polders and settlements around its edges. The 14th century alone saw catastrophic floods that killed tens of thousands of people across the wider region. Living beside the Zuderzee meant accepting an annual negotiation with destruction. The idea of simply closing off the Zuderzee, damming the entire mouth of the bay where it met the North Sea, had been proposed in various forms since at least the 17th century. Engineers and visionaries sketched plans and abandoned them. The technology did not exist. The scale was too enormous. And there was always the economic argument. The fishing communities, the shipping lanes, the ports that depended on the bay being exactly as it was. Change of that magnitude requires more than engineering ambition. It requires catastrophe to make it feel necessary. That catastrophe came in November 1894, not as a flood, but as a report. A young engineer named Cornelius Lely published a detailed and technically rigorous plan for enclosing the Zuderzee with a main barrier dam and reclaiming large portions of the bay as agricultural land. Lely was not the first to imagine such a project, but he was the first to make it seem genuinely buildable, to reduce the dream to specifications, to calculations, to cubic meters of clay and sand. His proposal was methodical and bold in equal measure, but it sat largely unacted upon for more than 2 decades, circulating in political and engineering circles, gathering cautious supporters and skeptical critics. What finally broke the deadlock was water. On the 13th and 14th of January 1916, a powerful storm drove the Zuderzee over its banks and across the surrounding polders. The floods that followed caused catastrophic damage across the region, inundating farmland, destroying homes, and demonstrating with brutal clarity what everyone already knew. The bay was an existential threat. Within months, the Dutch Parliament passed the Zuiderzee Act. The project that Lely had proposed 22 years earlier was now law. Work would begin on the most ambitious hydraulic engineering project in human history. The centerpiece of the entire plan was something called the Afsluitdijk, the enclosure dam, a structure that would seal the Zuderzee off from the North Sea completely, turning the bay into a controlled freshwater lake. The dam would run from the province of North Holland in the south to the province of Friesland in the north, spanning a total length of 32 kilometers across open water. It would be wide enough at its crest to carry a road. It would have to withstand North Sea storms that generated wave forces capable of moving boulders. And it would have to be built through tidal currents, across soft seabed sediments, in a body of water that was never fully calm. In the history of construction, there had been nothing quite like it. Before a single boulder could be placed, the engineers had to understand the water itself. The tidal dynamics of the Zuderzee were complicated. The bay exchanged water with the North Sea through a relatively narrow opening between the tip of North Holland and the island of Wieringen in the west, and through a broader passage to the north. Any dam crossing this gap would have to contend not only with the depth of the water, which reached around 5 meters in the deepest sections of the planned route, but with the volume and velocity of tidal flow. As construction progressed, those flows would intensify. The gaps left open in the dam would be forced to carry the entire tidal volume of the bay through an ever-shrinking opening, creating currents that could strip away freshly placed material almost as fast as workers could lay it. The solution was a combination of materials, sequencing, and sheer mass. The dam was not built like a wall, laid in a straight line from one shore to the other. It was built outward from both ends simultaneously, advancing in stages, with the most challenging central section left until last. Workers first established a foundation layer of clay and sand, placed by specially designed vessels that could distribute material accurately onto the seabed. On top of this foundation, they placed boulder clay, a dense, heavy material dredged from the seabed itself, packed into mats of interwoven willow branches called fascines, a technique the Dutch had used in earthworks for centuries, now adapted to this vastly larger scale. The fascine mattresses were sunk to the bottom and weighted with stone, providing a stable base that the currents could not easily scour away. The stone itself was another logistical challenge of staggering proportion. The Netherlands has almost no natural rock. It is a delta country, sand, clay, peat, with no mountains, no quarries worth the name. Every boulder, every piece of basalt, every concrete block used in the Afsluitdijk had to be brought in from elsewhere. Basalt came from quarries along the Rhine in Germany. Glacial boulders were gathered from fields across the northern Netherlands where Ice Age glaciers had deposited them thousands of years earlier. Stone was shipped, barged, railed, moved by every available means to the construction sites at each end of the dam. At the height of construction, the logistical operation resembled supplying a small army. The most dangerous moment in the entire construction process came in May 1932, as the two halves of the dam closed toward each other from their respective coasts. The final gap, through which the entire tidal volume of the Zuderzee was still rushing back and forth, was now barely more than a few dozen meters wide. The currents through that gap were extraordinary, powerful enough to make work almost impossible, capable of undermining and sweeping away material that had taken days to position. Engineers and workers watched the gap narrow with a mixture of professional calculation and genuine anxiety. The closure moment was not merely a construction milestone. It was the point at which the sea either accepted defeat or pushed back hard enough to undo everything. On the 28th of May 1932, the last gap in the Afsluitdijk was closed. The tidal flow stopped. The Zuderzee, which had exchanged water with the North Sea for geological epochs, was sealed. In the weeks and months that followed, the enclosed water gradually lost its saltiness as the rivers IJssel, Rhine, and others drained fresh water into the now enclosed basin. The former bay was renamed the IJsselmeer, the IJssel Lake, and it began its slow transformation from brackish sea to freshwater reservoir. The fishing communities that had worked its waters for generations found their world changed overnight. The herring disappeared. The character of the water, the smell of it, the color of it, everything shifted. It was progress and loss in the same breath. The Afsluitdijk itself became something more than a dam. Running along its crest was a road, National Road 7, that for the first time connected the provinces of North Holland and Friesland by land in a direct line. Before the dam, travel between these regions required going around the entire former bay, a journey of many hours. The dam reduced it to a drive of roughly 30 minutes. Sluices built into the dam at 2 points allowed excess fresh water to be discharged into the Wadden Sea when the IJsselmeer's water level rose too high. Locks allowed shipping to pass between the lake and the sea. The dam was not just a wall. It was infrastructure in the fullest sense, a piece of the country's circulatory system. But closing the bay was only the beginning. The deeper purpose of the Zuiderzee Works was land reclamation, the creation of entirely new provinces from the mud of the former seafloor. Even as the Afsluitdijk was being built, work had already begun on draining the first of the planned polders. The Wieringer Meer polder, located in the northwestern corner of the old Zuiderzee near the island of Wieringen, was the first. Its drainage was completed in 1930, even before the main dam was fully closed, and it added roughly 200 square kilometers of new agricultural land to the Netherlands. When workers walked out onto that newly exposed seabed for the first time, they found a landscape of dark, heavy clay, dotted with the anchors and anchors of boats that had once sailed over it, encrusted with shells and the remnants of a world that had spent centuries underwater. The reclamation process followed a precise sequence that Dutch engineers had refined over generations of smaller polder work, but had never applied at anything close to this scale. First, a ring of embankments, called a polderdijk, was constructed around the area to be reclaimed, sealed against the surrounding lake. Then, pumping stations, powered first by diesel engines and later by electricity, ran continuously to drain the water out. The earliest pumping stations used diesel power on a grand scale. The Lely pumping station at the IJsselmeer, completed in 1930, used 3 centrifugal pumps with a combined capacity that could move enormous volumes of water per minute, lowering the water level inside the enclosed area over a period of months. What emerged was not immediately farmland. It was a wet, unstable, almost lunar surface, vast stretches of blue-gray clay that could barely support a human footstep. Pioneer plants came before people. Reed grasses were seeded by aircraft across the newly exposed surfaces, their roots binding the soft clay and beginning the slow biological work of making soil. Over 3 to 5 years, the reeds grew, died, decayed, and created the first thin layer of organic matter. Rapeseed and other crops followed. By the time human settlement began, the land had been partially domesticated by the plants themselves. Roads were built, drainage ditches were dug, farmhouses were constructed according to a rational grid that bore no relationship to the ancient organic patterns of the old Dutch towns nearby. Because this land had no history. It was blank. It was designed. The Northeast Polder was drained between 1942 and 1943, adding another 460 square kilometers, and the town of Emmeloord was established at its center. The 2 Flevoland polders, Eastern Flevoland and Southern Flevoland, came later, drained in 1957 and 1968 respectively, adding combined area of roughly 900 square kilometers. Together with the Wieringer Meer, these reclaimed polders eventually formed the province of Flevoland, formally established as the Netherlands' 12th province in 1986. It is the largest artificial island in the world. The cities of Lelystad and Almere, built on land that was seabed within living memory, now have populations in the hundreds of thousands. The human cost of the project was real, though it manifested differently than the dramatic dangers of dam construction might suggest. The fishing communities of the old Zuiderzee faced the most acute disruption. Towns that had spent generations developing expertise in Zuiderzee fishing, catching eel, flounder, anchovy, and other species adapted to the bay's brackish conditions, found that expertise suddenly worthless. The lake that replaced the bay had different fish, different dynamics, different economics. Some fishing families adapted, others lost their livelihoods entirely. The government provided some compensation and assistance, but the transition was painful in ways that compensation cannot fully address. A way of life that had existed for centuries was simply over. The islands of the old Zuiderzee had their own reckoning. Urk, a deeply traditional fishing community that sat on an island in the middle of the old bay, found itself connected to the mainland for the first time as the polders were reclaimed around it. What had been an island accessible only by boat became a peninsula, then effectively a point on the mainland. The isolation that had shaped Urk's distinctive culture, its dialect, its traditional dress, its tight-knit community, was now structurally impossible to maintain in the same way. The outside world arrived whether Urk wanted it or not. It is still a fishing community. It still has a strong identity, but the sea that defined it is gone. The engineering legacy of the Zuiderzee Works extends far beyond the Netherlands. The project demonstrated at full scale what had previously been only theoretical: that very large bodies of open water could be enclosed, drained, and transformed into productive land using the tools of industrial-era hydraulic engineering. Dutch engineers who worked on the project carried that expertise outward. The knowledge of how to manage water at this scale, how to build dikes that resist storm surge, how to operate sluice systems, how to drain and stabilize newly exposed seabed, became one of the Netherlands' most significant exports. Countries from Bangladesh to South Korea to the American state of Louisiana have sought Dutch expertise in managing the complex relationship between land and water. There is a particular quality to the light in Flevoland that visitors sometimes remark on. It is unobstructed, open in the way that only very flat, very new land can be, where there are no hills or ancient tree lines to break the horizon, where the sky truly does begin at the edge of the ground and goes straight up. Walking across that land, you are aware of being somewhere that did not exist in the way that all other places exist, inherited through generations, worn down by history. Flevoland was made in a human lifetime. The soil under your feet has been soil for a shorter time than some of the people who farm it. There is something in that fact that is hard to name, a kind of compressed time, as though the landscape is still adjusting to the idea of itself. The Afsluitdijk itself was reinforced and upgraded in the decades following its construction. A major renovation project, begun in the second decade of the 21st century, strengthened the dam's outer face to meet modern storm safety standards and added new hydroelectric infrastructure, turbines built into the sluice structures that generate electricity from the controlled exchange of water between the IJsselmeer and the Zuderzee. The dam that was built to stop water is now also using water to produce power. This kind of adaptation, finding new uses for old infrastructure, adding capability without abandoning what works, is deeply characteristic of how the Dutch manage their hydraulic landscape. Nothing is static. The relationship between the land and water is always being renegotiated. Climate change has made that renegotiation more urgent. Sea levels in the southern North Sea are rising, and the projections for the coming century are substantial. The polders that were reclaimed from the Zuiderzee sit below sea level, some of them nearly 7 meters below the level of the surrounding North Sea. They are kept dry by constant pumping and by the integrity of the dike systems that surround them. If those systems fail, the consequences would be immediate and total. Dutch water managers know this, plan for it, model it, and lose sleep over it in ways that engineers in higher-lying countries perhaps do not have to. The Delta Works, the larger system of storm surge barriers, sluices, and dams built in the southern Netherlands following the catastrophic North Sea flood of 1953, represents another generation of the same instinct. Anticipate the worst and build ahead of it. What the Zuiderzee Works represent, taken whole, is something that resists easy categorization. It is engineering, certainly, some of the most ambitious civil engineering ever undertaken by any nation. But it is also a kind of assertion, a statement made by a small country against one of the most powerful natural forces on Earth, not through heroism in the Hollywood sense, but through decades of patient, methodical, technically brilliant work. The Dutch did not conquer the sea. That framing is too simple, and the Dutch themselves are too practical to believe it. What they did was reach an arrangement, a complicated, ongoing, high-stakes arrangement with a force that remains vastly more powerful than they are. The sea is still out there. The Zuderzee still moves with its tides on the north side of the Afsluitdijk. The North Sea still generates its storms. The arrangement holds because the dams are maintained, the pumps run, the monitoring systems work. Stop any of those things and the arrangement collapses. There is a phrase that appears in Dutch culture in various forms. God made the earth, but the Dutch made the Netherlands. It is usually said with a mixture of pride and dry humor, the kind that acknowledges both the achievement and the absurdity of the achievement. Standing on the Afsluitdijk, with the gray water of the Zuderzee on one side and the calmer, enclosed surface of the IJsselmeer on the other, and a road running 32 kilometers across open water beneath your feet, the phrase does not feel like boasting. It feels like a statement of fact so strange it had to become a joke to be bearable. This country made itself. It is still making itself, and the water is still there, patient on the other side of the dam, waiting for the moment when human attention slips. It has not slipped yet. The Dutch do not intend for it to. In the end, what the Zuiderzee Works leave you with is not triumph. It is something quieter, a deepened sense of what ordinary human persistence, applied over generations and aimed at a single purpose, can actually accomplish. There were no single heroic moments here, no lone geniuses standing at the bow of progress. There were engineers who spent entire careers on one section of one dam. There were dredge operators and clay packers and pump technicians and soil scientists who collectively moved enough material to reshape a national geography. There were fishing families who gave up the sea their grandparents had known so that new land could exist. There were farmers who were among the first humans ever to walk on the ground they were asked to cultivate. All of these lives, over more than 5 decades of sustained effort, added up to something that can now be measured in square kilometers and in the dry safety of millions of people who live below sea level without thinking about it. The Great Dike stands. The polders are farmed. The cities are inhabited. The pumps run. And somewhere under the flat fields of Flevoland, beneath the rows of tulips and the modern farmhouses and the ordinary routines of ordinary people, the old seabed is still there, compressed, patient, holding up a country that decided, against all natural logic, to exist exactly where it is.